Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
Season 3 is in full swing with worldwide leaders in their field talking about the latest science of nutrition and health. To catch people up, I'm Brian Sanders, and I've quit my job and dedicated my life to studying health and nutrition. I'm trying my best to be unbiased and to simplify the conflicting advice out there and distill down concepts into something anyone can understand. I'm not a doctor or nutritionist. I'm a mechanical engineer, and I've lost both of my parents to chronic disease and have set off on my own path for the last 4 years to study this topic and make sure I don't fall to the same fate. My role is the curator, the communicator. I've interviewed over 100 of the top scientists, doctors, nutritionists, fitness experts, and other health professionals, and have come to find some simple truths that I'd like to share. A lot of this will be presented in the feature-length documentary called Food Lies, but it's not all about the film. I'm spreading this information to the public any way I can. I do this podcast. I post daily ideas and information on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and soon I'll be doing more videos on YouTube. Search for Food Lies on any of these platforms. Dr. Gary Fettke has an amazing tale of deceit, deception, disinformation, conspiring dietitians, medical evangelism, his medical board attempting to silence him, and even John Harvey Kellogg, founder of the cereal company, and his anti-masturbation mission. A lot going on here and a lot of alliteration as well. Dr. Fettke is an orthopedic surgeon living in Tasmania off of Australia. He practices preventative medicine and helps treat patients long before resorting to surgical interventions. Like Professor Tim Noakes, he stood up to his medical board and powers that be that were trying to stop him from dispensing simple and logical nutrition advice like eating fresh, local, and seasonal foods instead of processed foods. He spent 3 years of his own time and money on this absurdity before being exonerated of all charges. Strap yourselves in, folks. This is a good one. As I'm recording this, I'm dealing with the harsh realities of a measly budget and worries of how to finish the Food Lies documentary properly. If you haven't supported it yet, please consider doing that now. It's a true community-powered project. If enough people pre-order the film at a pretty reasonable cost of $25, we can complete this in a matter of months instead of maybe a year. That's what we're facing if we don't have the funds. This will be made no matter what. Don't be worried about that. This is my life's work and all I care about right now. Thanks for your help. Just go to foodlies.org and click through to the Indiegogo campaign or click through the link in the show notes. We have an amazing woman named Amanda adding in $20 more for each person who contributes. Please take her up on her kind offer today. Also, please leave a review of the podcast on iTunes or the Apple Podcast app. I sent out a care package to listener Aaron from Ohio yesterday who had the review of the week. I really appreciate these reviews and they help get the podcast more visibility. And now here's Dr. Gary Fettke. Welcome, Gary Fettke, calling in from Tasmania. Good morning.
Morning, Brian.
Thanks for coming on. I really wanted to talk to you for a long time. I've heard your story a couple years ago. And, we had Professor Tim Noakes on, and he has one of these amazing tales of overcoming adversity. And so do you. You were silenced by the Dietitians Association or your government, your medical board?
The medical board were behind the actual silencing, but it all started with the Dietitians Association of Australia.
Yeah. So let's get into that story. But first of all, so you're an orthopedic surgeon, and so you handle cutting off people's limbs when it's too late, right? When they have type 2 diabetes and these complications.
In the worst case scenario, my day-to-day practice is an orthopedic surgeon looking after joint problems. And when you look at my patients, they're clearly getting fatter and sicker as the years go by and higher rates of diabetes. And my public hospital work has involved, particularly the last 10 to 15 years, a lot of work with patients with diabetes and the end stage complications. And it was getting to the point where it was very much a tsunami coming at you. These people are coming along, they've been following traditional advice, they're getting poorly controlled diabetes, and then ultimately they start getting foot ulcers. Then I need to end up being involved in debriding their feet, lopping toes off and parts of their feet, and then in the worst case scenario, doing amputations. And there was a time there where I was virtually, taking someone to theatre every week for the same procedures. That's when I started looking into what could be done from my patient's aspect. At the same time frame, I was actually pre-diabetic. This is going back several years. I had a tumour 20 odd years ago. I was 23 kilos. That's nearly 50 pounds heavier than where I am now. pre-diabetes, high blood pressure, and I was doing what I thought was the right thing. I was eating by the dietary guidelines. I was exercising, to lose weight, to maintain weight, and I was starting to look like my patients, getting fatter and sicker. So ultimately, I looked towards nutrition, and particularly sugar. And virtually my crime from the system point of view is I started advising my patients to not eat as much sugar, and particularly in the hospital environment where, it was quoted back to me, but I did use this slide in a talk saying hospital food is crap and it's killing my patients.
Mm-hmm.
But effectively, hospital food is high in sugar, high in carbs, polyunsaturated oils, and by my reckoning is an inflammatory material. And as time's gone on, I've challenged that within the hospital, only to find out that I was incurring the wrath of the dietitians in the hospital, ultimately the Dietitians Association of Australia, and then there was an extensive campaign over a period of time to have me silenced, utilising our medical board.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's true. I know that you guys uncovered documents even that showed that they were colluding.
That was not surprising, but shocking to find myself and several others named on internal documents from the Australian Breakfast Cereal Manufacturing Forum. So they're the heads of the cereal industry here in Australia, and with their links into New Zealand and around the world. So we've got literally the CEOs of Kellogg's, Sanitarium here in Australia, Nestle, Freedom Foods, all sit down and have lunch together every few months and discuss what they're going to be doing with their marketing and stuff like that. Now, I've got no problem with that. They can do that. But in 2014, we uncovered documents from 2014 that said that cereal sales are down and the concepts of low carb and paleo are to blame, which is their own internal assessment. But what it went on from there was to point out that there are key influences here around the world, and there were 8 of us named in Australia, and I was the only doctor named for effectively targeting. So we've got a document with the Breakfast Cereal Manufacturers Forum stating that I required targeting, and at the same time on that same board was the member of the board of the Dietitians Association, and the Dietitians Association was being funded directly by the cereal industry to market the benefits of cereal and sugar.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a clear identification of the processed food industry utilising the Dietitians Association of Australia to market their cereal and their sugar message. And along the way, they decided to target a few people, of which I was the only doctor in Australia that got to wear that somewhat non-distinctive badge of honour.
And all you were really doing was saying, eat less sugar.
Look, I've got a website called nofructose.com. That's how my story started. I went on from there as I started having to defend this concept of sugar being, bad for us in the quantities we were having. I started doing more and more research and ultimately came up with that nutritional model of inflammation where, it's not just sugar. I think it's the combination of fructose, refined carbohydrates and polyunsaturated oils that when you put them together biochemically, that becomes a model of inflammation. And inflammation sits behind every disease right through from obesity, diabetes, mental health, cancer, the inflammatory bowel diseases. Virtually everything has an inflammatory
Cognitive
basis
decline.
behind it. So therefore, oh, absolutely. I mean, that's type 3 diabetes in some respects. Long, prolonged hypometabolism of glucose in the brain is well and truly associated with dementia. So I put that model together and then recommended to my patients and myself, my family, my team, my patients to do the opposite, which was to effectively do low carb, healthy fat living, which is reduce your processed carbohydrate, reduce your sugar intake, move away from the seed and vegetable oils and get back towards the saturated fats of butter, coconut oil. And therein sort of lies a problem. What we didn't realise is that I was actually advocating that we reduce processed food, but I was also advocating that meat's actually fine in the diet. And some of the pushback we've actually had over time is because I've been recommending that meat's fine, and particularly red meat. So in summary, I was reported to the medical board in 2014. It was 2.5-year investigation, and it was determined that I was not to ever speak about nutrition, even if it was shown that low-carb, healthy fat living was to be the best practice. And I was not to advise my patients if they've got diabetes that they should reduce their sugar and carb intake.
What was that based on? I don't even get that.
Well, that was based on the fact that theoretically I'm not qualified to give nutritional advice, even though I do have a medical degree which has a basis in science and biochemistry. I mean, the ruling was ludicrous. I felt so. We went to the public. the public came to our support, and we'll be forever grateful for that. And I needed to go through 2 Senate inquiries giving evidence about the problems of the medical board here in Australia. And ultimately, the case, after a lot of lobbying, was reviewed independently and was thrown out within a few weeks, but only after several years of trials and tribulations and a personal and financial cost to myself and the family. But we couldn't have done that without, as I say, the support. And I couldn't have done it without Belinda's work either, which she made the comment early on that Tim and myself were getting hammered about the science and we're in trouble over what's a complete no-brainer. And it wasn't until she said, well, you guys are going blue in the face talking about the science. There's got to be something else going on. And that's when she started looking at the vested interests. We thought it was just going to be simply a matter of, some personal issues and then maybe the corporates were involved. We had no idea where that was going to head with all of her research in the last few years into religious ideology, and particularly the role of the Adventist Church in shaping our food guidelines over 100 years now.
Yeah, I was so curious about this because I myself know that for all of history, we've embraced meats and whole foods and local, whatever we could get. So why do we all of a sudden think that they're bad? And it didn't make any sense to me, but you and Belinda went back and figured this stuff out.
Well, it all started with the fact that APRA, our medical board, utilised an expert witness. Now, even the medical board don't know where he materialised from, and I suspect he was put up by the food industry. So Mark Walquist at the time is an emeritus professor of nutrition, highly regarded, and one of the key players in world nutrition. And we couldn't work out why on earth they got out the biggest gun that they could to hammer just a little old orthopedic surgeon in Launceston, Tasmania. We are actually a small place. So Belinda started looking into him, tried contacting him because he seemed to be not an unreasonable person. And anyway, at the time he was working for Sanitarium, which is the biggest cereal manufacturer here in Australia. And New Zealand has major interests right around the world. And as time's gone on, we've looked more into what Sanitarium stands for rather than just the individuals. And Sanitarium here in Australia is owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They don't pay any taxes. They are heavily involved in medical education and particularly nutritional education at all layers, right through from schools through to universities, advising the government and medical associations here in Australia. And then Belinda really looked at the role of the Adventist Church in the US, the UK, South Africa, and what her results were mind-blowing, fascinating, and of deep concern. So everything I'm going to, we'll cover coming up now has actually been well acknowledged by the Adventist Church in about August of 2018. They actually came out with an article in a journal called Religion, and pretty well acknowledging all of this information. So, it may sound a bit out there, but listen on. So our current food guidelines have turned out to be a complete disaster. We look at what's called the standard American diet, standard Australian diet, that SAD concept, which is a cereal and grain-based food pyramid. And there's a push further and further down the track to have less and less meat and less dairy. And have over time been heading towards what you'd clearly consider to be a vegetarian pathway. Cereal, nuts, legumes, have your fruit, and avoid the meat and dairy. So what Belinda did, and we've studied quite a bit, is actually look at the origins of our food guidelines. And they go back to temperance movement in the 1860s, but particularly in 1917 when the American Dietetics Association was formed. So a woman by the name of Lena Cooper was instrumental in founding the American Dietetics Association. And she went on to write the textbooks for dietetics for the next 30 to 40 years. Every dietetics association in the world has followed, in the Western world, has followed the American model. So the Australian, the UK, Canadian, the South African, New Zealand dietitians associations have all pretty well followed the American model. Now, the issue we have with Lena Cooper was that she was actually working alongside a fellow named John Harvey Kellogg at that time of the Kellogg's cereal industry. She herself was a vegetarian. She was a Seventh-day Adventist. And those early books have continued to have this push the cereal pathway for a long period of time. So we've got John Harvey Kellogg and the Seventh-day Adventists being involved in effectively shaping our dietetics information right from the word go. and then continuing that on through the last 100 years. And there's good evidence of this vegetarian push and now vegan push into the dietary guidelines of the US. And as you know, the US dietary guidelines are often followed suit by many countries around the world. So if we look at the fact that the dietary guidelines have been ineffective and they're cereal-based, they've been shaped by the cereal industry right from the word go. But what is of more concern is how John Harvey Kellogg and Leonard Cooper and the Adventist Church came to the realisation that we needed to have a cereal-based anti-meat vegetarian agenda. So Ellen G. White is one of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. She's described as their prophetess. And in the 1860s, the church was formed. They had some ideas which were a little bit strange at the time, but nonetheless came out of the temperance movement concept of trying to eat clean and avoid alcohol, because at that time alcohol was associated with violence. You couldn't actually get clean water, so a lot of people, a lot of communities around the world drank watered down alcohol, and then violence may have been associated with that. But Ellen G. White, her initial book, and her belief was that meat causes violence and meat causes masturbation. And her very first book that she put out on behalf of the Adventist Church was on the effects of meat causing masturbation. And masturbation was the worst possible sin and would stop you from gaining salvation. In that same time frame, John Harvey Kellogg was a 12-year-old boy who was living with the family, the White family, and typesetting her original book. And John Harvey Kellogg went through his life with very strong Adventist upbringing, doing a lot of typesetting as a child. He then became a doctor and supported by the White family, and ultimately was heavily involved in setting up the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan, and is the father of several hundred patents. But his major patent, which is, we're still legacy today, is that he invented cornflakes. But he invented the cornflakes to develop a bland food that was cold, and it was there to quell your lustful thoughts and to be an anti-masturbation food. Your listeners may find that sort of unbelievable, but I can guarantee if you Google cereal and masturbation, you'll come up with the name John Harvey Kellogg. This is well and truly documented over the last 100 years. And the Adventist Church don't hide any of this information. In fact, they're quite proud of the fact that they've been involved in medical evangelism and trying to shape our food guidelines for that period of time. And here we are today with a cereal-based vegetarian agenda, anti-meat and anti-dairy, based on a concept of religious ideology to stop us from masturbating so that you can gain salvation.
Yeah. So this is a time.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. It's crazy. And this is a time in the 1860s when we didn't have a lot of science. We didn't know a lot of how things worked. Women didn't have a lot of rights even. They were getting beaten by their husbands. And that's part of the reason for the temperance movement. And so she had visions, right?
As a 16-year-old, she had a head injury and she had visions. Some of those visions have been questioned now as being sort of copied from other people of the time. She was influenced by a fellow by the name of Sylvester Graham, who goes back to, I think, 1830s to 1840s. To put a little bit more perspective on it, at that time, people were coming off the land from farming. They were coming into cities. The men were leaving their families. Meat, if you ate it on the farm, was actually probably, clean and fresh. But by the time you started transporting it into the cities, without refrigeration, it had some problems. Therefore, they started salting meat. And I can see that meat as an item back in that period of time might have been considered to be troublesome. But the problem is the fact that it then was the cause of masturbation, and if you started eating meat, you wouldn't get salvation. That's a long bow to have been drawn at that time. She also came up with that concept of breakfast is the most important meal of the day, which has become entrenched in our thinking. So there were things happening in that period of time, but they were actually just visions. They were not based on science. It was based on a belief that they needed to eat from the Garden of Eden diet, which was cereals, grains, fruit, nuts and legumes. And you'll keep hearing that message pushed now through the vegan agenda. So the vegetarian diet of the Adventists is actually vegan. The term veganism, vegan didn't actually crop up until the 1940s. So the Adventist Garden of Eden diet, which is cropping up now on these, the Eat Lancet material in the United Nations, is actually an Adventist term, not based on any science and arguably not based on religious text. I'm actually not that good on religious text, but if you start looking around Twitter in particular, there's good arguments saying that the take that the Adventist Church has gotten on the Garden of Eden diet is quite flawed.
Yeah, just to cut
But
in
I
for a
don't know if we
second.
want to go down the religion pathway today.
Not really, but just to cut in, I did see that, there is some stuff in the Bible saying, eat these animals. So it's almost their own take on it.
It is definitely their own take. One of the fascinating things from a biblical term is that I didn't want to go down this for too long, but Cain apparently killed Abel out of jealousy. And Abel gave God an offering of meat and flesh, and whereas Cain gave an offering of plant-based food. And so that moment of jealousy that caused Cain to kill Abel, it seems to have come over the whole plant-based versus meat argument. So here we are, however far down the track, still having the same argument in society.
Yeah. So what happens next? So she has these visions. She thinks that it's causing violence. They don't really know how to connect things scientifically. So it kind of makes sense that, we were guessing back then. Meat might have made people sick because it wasn't properly refrigerated. So yeah, what happens from there?
Well, meat has effectively been seen as the most evil substance by the church, and particularly red meat in that whole vegan culture. And so they've effectively tried to demonise it over time. So originally it was meat causes violence, then meat causes masturbation. The term meat causes cancer is actually one of Ellen G. White's as well. We then come into the 20th century, and the term meat causes heart disease is the next one. Then come back to meat causing cancer, which is relative risk ratios which are incredibly low and have been trumped up far more than anything else. And now we're on to the latest phase, because all of those other ones have failed to be proven in science. So now we've got meat causes climate change. And it's all propaganda. It's flawed science. A lot of the articles that are quoted by the current vegans activists have been retracted, including quite a powerful one by the World Health Organization. Nonetheless, we keep hearing outdated science coming at us from a group who are particularly hell-bent on this vegan pathway. A lot of people are disbelief that the Adventist Church is actually that powerful. And, for a group that are actually only around about 19 to 20 million in the world, so 0.3% I've worked out of the world's population, about 1% of Christians, they are the second biggest educator in the world after the Catholic Church. And you've got to realise that the Adventists have a lot of money behind them. They are effectively entrenched in the cereal industries of the world. 101 cereal companies were started in Battle Creek, Michigan. So they've got their profits and their tithe that comes from the cereal industry significantly. They're also vertically and horizontally integrated into the soy industry of the world. A fellow by the name of Harry China Miller was an Adventist missionary and doctor who went to China and effectively came back with soy and the whole soy infant product, and pushed very hard for that to be introduced into the US. He and the Adventist Church set up, I think, 19 sanitariums and soy factories in China. And when you start looking around, you'll actually find, significant amounts of the fake meat, fake dairy, soy industry are all tied up with the Adventist Church. So they've got an enormous amount of backing. They own 22 food industries outside of the US. They produce, within the Adventist circles, nearly 4,000 different food products, and I'll call them food products because they're not real food. And at a schooling level, they've got nearly 8,000 schools around the world, primary schools, secondary, universities. And the doctrine of the Adventist Church is that the right arm of the church is medical evangelism. So they're conscientious objectors. They don't go into anything violent, and they are pushing medical evangelism and pushing a health message.
Well, what exactly is medical evangelism?
Well, medical evangelism is that if you actually can encourage people to be healthier, and their number one promotion is that of veganism, then you are going to then convert them across to the church for their own salvation and your own salvation. And so the agenda is that Christ is coming back again, and the more people that are converted to Christianity and the more Adventists we have and the cleaner we're all living, then the sooner Christ is coming back. And this is what their driving force, and that's okay to have a belief and they can have choice, but we have an issue that choice is being pushed upon us into dietary guidelines which are non-scientific and in fact making us sicker. Mm-hmm. So each to their own, they can do what they want, but I don't really, I'm standing up for the fact that we can't have this forced literally down our throats. when it's actually been, I believe, shown to be detrimental to our health. And actually, the more you look into it, the cereal-based monocultures of the world are detrimental to our environment.
Absolutely.
Adventist Church owns over 60 publishing houses, 850 plus radio stations, 441 television stations back in 2016. And in 2016, or in their annual report, then they had they noted they did 70,000 podcasts, all pretty well promoting this medical evangelism vegan pathway, with 1.1 billion downloads. So incredibly influential in the medical sector. The Medical Journal of Australia, for instance, had a couple of years ago a whole supplement on the benefits of vegetarianism. Now, when you went through it, the authors were pretty well either Adventists or working for Kellogg's or the Adventist system here in Australia. And the entire thing was funded by Sanitarium and went out to every doctor in Australia. These are scary numbers. The other thing that we really fell upon end of 2017 was that the back-end material on 99% of doctors here in Australia was actually funded by Kellogg's and Sanitarium. So if you go to your general practitioner, your doctor, in Australia, virtually every general practice has medical director or best practice software running on it. And if you're a doctor and you sort of look up, you've got cholesterol problem, and you look for a printed handout for your patients, the Adventist message was literally sitting there as the support material for every single person in Australia to be given by their doctors. And I know many doctors that literally just printed it out thinking it had been tested and was valid, but in fact, effectively it was just cereal industry propaganda. So whether or not you've got diabetes or irritable bowel syndrome, cancer, whatever, every bit of resource material was slanted with this propaganda.
The plant-based approach. That's why it's so rampant everywhere. Everyone just believes, the everyday person just thinks, of course, the plant-based diet is how you cure cancer. It's how you do this. This is what I've heard from my doctors.
But your doctor doesn't even realize that they inadvertently have just been printing out a bit of material supplied by the cereal industry.
Yeah.
Incredibly good marketing by the cereal industry over time.
Genius.
You've got to admire them.
Yeah.
But you've also got to then work out where the cereal industry has come from and what their agenda is. A, it's profit, but B, it's also this religious ideology towards salvation.
It's one of the craziest things I've ever heard. I've heard you on a podcast years ago and checked all this stuff out, and it's all completely true. It's like the one true conspiracy theory that's actually, ruining people's lives, I think. And I know you think.
I hate the word conspiracy. I mean, they actually truly believe what they're doing. They've acknowledged this, as I said, openly in August last year. We actually have a lot of ex-Adventists and even some current Adventists who have actually, caught up with us and said, "Look, you're absolutely right. We're not denying any of this." And it was quoted in that document in August last year. Actually, there's material we're actually referenced in that material that they've actually that they've published. So there's no hiding this, and in fact, they've hidden it in plain sight for 100 years. And they, as a group, are well-intentioned towards the health of us all. But the fact, they regularly quoted that Adventists and vegetarians live longer. Well, there's a lot of documentation which counteracts it. But because they keep repeating that message over and over and over, we start believing it as a society. And the dietitians of the world, particularly the Western world, have been following the party line. And it's actually what I call generational education. You'll believe what your teachers told you and what their teachers told you. And if you repeated the message for 100 years and it's been in your textbooks for 100 years, this whole plant-based thing has become entrenched in our collective wisdom when in fact it's completely flawed.
Yeah, of course you believe it. It's like it's the authority figures, your doctors, your mentors, your superiors tell you this, and you hear it your whole life and you just believe it. And I love that term generational knowledge and how to explain how this all works.
The flow on now is that the corporate food industry is, well and truly entrenched itself in this plant-based concept because that's, you can package food. You can put cereals and grains in cardboard boxes. You can put polyunsaturated oils and things, and that'll keep them going for a lot longer. The more sugar you put in things, the longer the shelf life.
Profit margin.
Before they go.
All about profit margin. Yeah, you're saying all the things that increase profit margin.
So we've got the corporate food industry entrenched with religious ideology, and that's becoming part of our medical education. If the current terms which you should alarm bells should be ringing is if you hear the terms plant-based diet or lifestyle medicine, which is where this huge push is at the moment, and supported by the Adventist Church right around the world, lifestyle medicine. And the other term to listen out for is exercises medicine, which comes from ILSI, which is the International Life Sciences Institute, set up originally by Coca-Cola, and most of the food industry is heavily behind that one. And that's the concept that if you're overweight and sick, then the problem is you need to go out and exercise more. So we've got a coming together at the moment where the terms plant-based diet, lifestyle medicine, and exercises medicine are all converging to become part of the medical education of doctors and health professionals around the world. And that confluence you can almost see that in this most recent huge push for the Eat Lancet campaign. And again, when you start scratching the surface of that Eat Lancet, it all sounds good. We should eat well and the planet will do well and the people will do well. Sounds all good on the surface. But then when you start scratching underneath it, you see that the supporters of that are multinationals that include Kellogg's, PepsiCo, Unilever, the margarine production. The fake meat producers. Unilever's now, going into huge amounts of fake meat production. And then, so you go back further into it and you find that the Adventist Church is involved in it at a grassroots level and behind some of these companies. And there's billions of dollars being invested into encouraging us as a community, as a society, to be travelling this path. But that suits the religious ideology. It suits the corporate profit endpoint. But I honestly believe it's going to be to our long-term detriment as well as to the environmental detriment.
Well, it's already been on that path. And just to make sure people caught that, he's talking about the Eat Lancet, which was behind this huge study and news push that just happened in January around the 18th. They called it the Planetary Diet, and it got picked up by every news organization in the world and said that we all need to be eating 7 grams of meat per day only, and that we need to be plant-based for the environment and for your health. And the organization is actually led by a billionaire vegan, Gunhild Stordelin.
Well, she's the front cover piece of it, but when you look at the behind it, it is the food industry.
Oh, exactly.
And it's the media industry that's behind it. Virtually all major news outlets in the world were given this information last week and had an embargo on it until the release date. This is a huge media campaign put on by a vegan activist group, where they collected 37 experts, got them together under the one roof and got them convinced, that this is what we need to say. However, there was a great article that came out in the last couple of days that my understanding is that the vast majority of those 37 experts actually don't eat from this diet. And when you actually look at what the diet is and what their proposal is, one of the lead authors of that thing, we've got his pictures. He is promoting that this is now the Garden of Eden diet. Now, the Garden of Eden diet is actually, come all the way back. This is an Adventist-influenced eat nuts, legumes, fruits, and grains. It is not based on our health. It's based on an ideology for salvation, and even worse, not just for salvation, but to stop us from masturbating. And I can't make this stuff up. It is as crazy as that we've got the World Health Organization and the United Nations being influenced by a group of activists who are very vocal and incredibly well funded, but not actually based on a balanced scientific view.
Well, the problem is it's so ingrained in them. I think they think they're doing the right thing, that even if they don't know, they're being influenced. And I mean, there's the money, there's so many things that are there, but I feel like it's almost a foregone conclusion these days that plant-based is healthy, that meat is bad for the environment, that I don't even think they even realize it sometimes.
I use the word gullible, and if you start believing what you first hear in the media, and if you actually believe that what you should eat is actually directed to you from Kellogg's, PepsiCo and Unilever, to take just 3 names on there, then you're gullible. The trouble is we have very powerful visual movies that are out there convincing teenagers that veganism is the only way to go and that every bit of meat produced on the planet is done in a cruel fashion. Now, I'm not into factory farming, but I do think regenerative agriculture is our only exit strategy as a planet.
Absolutely.
But we come back to the influence of education. We've got our children being educated about vegetarianism, veganism. right through to secondary schools, the movies, the media. Hollywood children's movies, if you start looking at them from a cynical point of view, are recommending the plant-based concepts. And this whole culture is sitting right underneath it. And so the children and the teenagers, and veganism is highest amongst teenage girls, with a lot of peer pressure. They've become the foot soldiers of the food industry. So that they've got these passionate believers that are going, and young people going along and storming restaurants and butcheries. 18 months ago, we were at a children's zoo in Melbourne with our kids. We had a bit of a lunch there, and I saw 6 vegan activists standing over a teenager who was tending a calf in the zoo. And they were clearly threatening her, just by their stance. And I went and intervened and, just effectively stood between this teenager and these 6 veganists. And it was just an ugly scene that en masse, literally, standing over and threatening a young girl who was really just doing what she thought was right, was helping out in a children's zoo tending a calf. And this is the scary stuff. This is a highly organised movement with a lot of funding behind it, who are using our young people and who are falling for the propaganda.
Yeah, some people who aren't in this nutrition world like we are, they come to me and they're like, oh, well, why haven't I heard of this? Everything I see on the news or in the newspaper and the TV, it's all saying one thing and you're saying the other thing. And the only way our information gets out are on these independent sources like podcasts or YouTube or maybe an independent documentary. But it's so obvious that they're getting all the information from the big media companies that are being paid by the food industry. That's how they make money. Of course, they're spreading this message. That's how they exist. All the packaged food, processed food, fast food, that's what pays their bills. There's no way this message is going to be on the mainstream.
I see that as a society, we're about to have a social cliff, not a social change. Our health is deteriorating. I often say that the wealth of society is determined by the health of the people. And the health of the people is determined by the health of the food, and the health of the food is determined by the health of the soil. And we're seeing the biggest agricultural export of the world is our topsoil at the moment. It's not a food product. It's actually, we're losing organic matter in our topsoil. It's being eroded by wind and rain. Because of that lack of organic material now, we've had an 80% reduction in our organic material in our topsoil in the last 100 years, and I think it's something like 30% in just the last 10 years. And if you don't have organic material in your topsoil, then you lose the ability to retain moisture and nutrients. So as we approach this, we're getting, I think, a crisis point. Everyone can argue whether or not that's climate change or social change or health change. And what I'm advocating, or what we're advocating by saying, look, eat fresh, local and seasonal, eat low carb, healthy fat, that's the definition. If you eat fresh, local and seasonal, you're having a food low in sugar, low in processed carbs, you're not having seed oils. What that means is that you're actually taking away buying power. You're taking away dollars from the corporate food industry, and it's actually decentralizing power. So if you take away your buying dollars from your supermarket and you take them down to your farmer's market, your local community, this is a massive economic change. And I think this is where the corporate food industry are, well and truly after people like myself and yourself and others who are speaking out in this forum, that we are encouraging people to actually take back control of their health by not buying corporate food. And as a result of that, they're actually going to be healthier. They're not going to require the pharmaceutical requirements of ill health. And we have a sickness industry out there that's just as dependent on us, remaining sick as well. But it's being, again, influenced by, generational education, which has come from the food industry and ideology. I actually think the next step here is that social media remains our only stand against this whole process. But then it is of concern to see someone like Google is also involved in the Eat Lancet program. If you look closely, and I've spoken with many others around the world on this one, the metrics and on analytics of social media are changing against us. The concepts of anything against the plant-based diet are actually drifting down on Google searches. Of deep concern was if you actually look up, if you Google sources of iron, food sources of iron, I think the list had 10 vegetarian sources and didn't list the option of meat, let alone red meat. So a simple search on Google is now even working against what the best sources of iron, which is red meat.
Yeah, wow.
And it's only a matter of time, I think, before in some respect. We won't be completely shut down, but our reach on social media will be dragged back a whole notch. And I think it's already happening.
I think your wife mentioned that her Facebook posts, their reach is a fraction of what they used to be for some reason.
Well, it's not for some reason. It's actually, and I won't mention the other people that I've spoken to around the world, but some very leading individuals in the low carb world are actually noticing exactly the same. You find you've got 10% of the reach that you had a year ago. And, sure, if we want to start paying for it, then we might be able to extend that a little bit more. But, we're all running, on the smell of an oily rag. Of deep concern, even just recently, was that the vegetarian vegan movement is actually funding advertisements against low carb. If you went on and Googled low carb bread on YouTube, for instance, directly underneath it was a sponsored advertisement for The Low Carb Fraud, a book written by T. Colin Campbell. That subsequently come down, but nonetheless, for 3 months there was a very active campaign of sponsored ads whenever you mention the word low carb.
Wow.
So this is a campaign against what we're advocating, and all we're actually talking about is eat fresh, local, and seasonal based on your culture.
I love that term. It's so simple and it's just so easy. You don't even have to get, like you said, it's by definition low carb, healthy fat, right? We're not low carb zealots. It's not like we're some insane people that just have an agenda against carbs. We're just talking about eating like we've always eaten throughout history, is fresh, local, seasonal.
That's all. My talks have always been just about the biochemistry. My nutritional model of inflammation, the effects of carbohydrate on diabetes is all based around the biochemistry at a cellular level. It's not based on association data. And the problem going forward is that we've got all this propaganda out there that's all talking about association material rather than actually talking about science. And nutrition science, again, I'll come back to the inventors. They said that they invented the term nutrition science back in the early 20th century. And they've been instrumental in keeping us confused. I talk about the scientific method, which is what was normally understood in science, that you actually make an observation, you have a hypothesis, you test it and you retest it. And then if you find something, you may implement it after it's been gone through peer review. Well, nutritional science has had nothing to do with that at all. It's been about trying to find out what food you can actually produce the cheapest with the greatest profitability and the greatest palatability. And so somewhere along the line, we got confused to believe that nutritional science is the same as medical science and the scientific method. And as a result of that, here we are today, believing association data.
Yeah, just to be clear, you're talking about this epidemiology, these food questionnaires, and just looking at populations and asking them what they ate.
And what they ate in the past and what they ate last week. I mean, there's a huge difference between trying to remember what you ate and then actually, whether or not you ate it whilst you were running around, or whether or not you ate it cold or you ate it warm. My favourite, association piece of data was that there is a linear relationship between murder rates in New York and peanut butter consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And it's completely and utterly ridiculous, and it's got no relevance whatsoever. And
there's tons of those, yeah.
We seesaw between the media saying, chocolate's good for you, chocolate's bad for you, tea's good for you, tea's bad for you, red meat's bad for you, red meat's good for you. This whole layers of confusion that are out there, I think, is a deliberate disinformation. If you keep everyone confused, nobody will actually know what the answer is. And I've certainly been accused of, creating some of that confusion. And I'm not into creating the confusion. I'm getting people to start questioning, stop being so gullible, look at the biochemistry, because that's largely can't be faked by science. That's the basis of it all. And when you start looking at the vested interests which have been shaping nutritional policies, they haven't been shaping it based on biochemistry. It's based on a belief system that's about profit as well.
And I love the term disinformation, because it's not misinformation, it's purposeful.
Absolutely. I use that term very deliberately because these are the same tactics that were used by the tobacco industry. When you start going through the corporate books, you'll also find that the tobacco industry is effectively, owning the food industry, and vice versa. They're inextricably linked. They're using the same tactics they did 30, 40 years ago. And here we are paying the price as a society, getting, fatter and sicker. And I don't mind using that term fatter because people say it's politically incorrect. You're supposed to say overweight or obese or
Mhm.
But the long and the short of it is that we are getting fatter and sicker, and we need to do something about it. And it's certainly not by travelling the pathways that have been recommended by dietary guidelines for 100 years. And in fact, for the last 40 years, we've actually done that. There's good data out of the US, backed up by Australian data that I've seen, that we have actually reduced our red meat consumption. We've increased our nuts, legumes, fruits, and vegetables. And it hasn't worked. So, more of the same thing isn't the answer.
Yeah, I showed the graph of that in the trailer of Food Lies, where as we ate more whole grains and we ate less meat, the obesity and chronic disease went up.
And methane production has actually gone up as we've reduced our cattle numbers on the planet.
I looked at that too. I found the EPA data. This is just the plain EPA data, and our cattle has steadily gone down for the past 50 years.
There were more ruminants on the planet 100 years ago than there are now. The bison crossing the plains of the US. Sure, again, come back, farming animals in feedlots is not the answer. We've actually got, there's less than 4% of the world's surface can be used for agricultural practice of a farming in the grains, legumes sort of concept. Whereas you've got at least 20 to 25% of the planet that's rangeland and grassland that actually can be used in a very sustainable fashion for ruminants, particularly cattle and sheep and goats, that can actually eat this stuff called grass. And grass comes from CO2 and can turn it into a food product, but can also turn it into restoring organic matter back to our soil.
Exactly.
I keep using on Twitter the term hashtag innocent cows. Stop blaming them. They're actually trying to save the planet.
They're putting nutrients back in the soil.
And we need to, the whole topic needs to be treated with some respect. But Belinda and I we're at a point now where we might be called cynical, but we actually understand when someone speaks out, whether or not it's in a journal article or in the media or at a conference, we actually know what hat they're wearing. So we often say, look, you can come to our table. We'd love to have a chat to you. We just want to know what hat you're wearing. And a lot of activists may be wearing a hat, but they may not know actually why they're wearing that hat. And I'm all for everyone having their opinion, but make certain you declare what your opinion, what your bias is before you come into a meeting. Mm-hmm. And there's so many undeclared conflicts of interest by people in the industry who are shaping guidelines. Now, and again, I'm fine if you want to go along to the World Health Organization and the United Nations and bang on about veganism, but make certain that you're coming along declaring that your Garden of Eden diet's actually coming from a religious ideology and not based on science. It comes shrouded in science, but it's actually not based on it. It falls over when you put it up against scientific information, you put it up against nutrient value. And I think you alluded to recently, Zoe Harkham's looked at this, as well as Marty Kendall here in Australia. The nutrient value of the Garden of Eden diet just falls completely and utterly short on multiple vitamins and nutrients. So here we are having a group of billionaires and billionaire industries advocating what we should be eating, even though they're not eating it themselves, and recommending, literally like Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake. It might make them happy, but it's certainly not going to make them healthy.
Absolutely. And I love what Marty Kendall and Zoe Harcombe are doing. And also the bioavailability of these plant foods just aren't the same as the animal foods. And I did an interview with Dr. David Klurfeld, who was on the working panel of the WHO that decided that red meat was a carcinogen. And he was against it. He had a big problem. He's a USDA PhD. A big problem with them not declaring their conflict of interest. I don't think he was ever allowed to do an interview before I got special clearance to do it with him. And he talked about it was full of vegetarian vegans that had undeclared conflict of interest.
Well, the vegetarian position paper adopted by the American Dietetics Association back in the 1980s, I think might even be late as 92. There were 9 people on that group. You have to research fairly hard. 7 of them were from the Adventist Church, and 8 of them were vegetarians, and the only other one was actually someone who came from the processed food industry. So you've got the dietetics associations of the world, speak out against fad diets like low carb or paleo or terms like that. Yet they are quite willing to adopt that veganism and vegetarianism is safe mantra, but their working parties on that have actually come from groups that are based with ideology. The 4 papers utilised in the Australian document were written again by Adventist vegetarians, and it's just been said, okay, well, therefore now this is safe, when in fact it's completely biased research that comes with that vested interest. I know I keep coming back to the Adventist Church, but their role in all of this over such a long period of time has that they've gotten foot soldiers who don't even understand where their history lies, promoting their product. And are we all gullible? Well, not all of us, but there's a hell of a lot on the planet that are at this point in time. It's important that we all start questioning the information that comes with us and not just taking it for what it's been advertised.
Yeah. Well, actually, I wanted to go back to that Coca-Cola thing, the exercise is medicine. And speaking of what you're just talking about, it's a tricky way to say that drinking soda isn't that bad, right? If you just exercise, you can burn off these calories and, the real thing you need to be doing is exercise and, this sugar doesn't matter type of thing.
Oh, and well, it's called health washing. Health washing your material. So if you've got, Coca-Cola sponsor the Olympics, we've got McDonald's sponsoring the Olympics in the past. You've got Coca-Cola sponsoring the FIFA World Cup of Soccer, the biggest sporting event in the world. And, oh gosh, therefore, if you exercise harder, you'll get rid of your health issues. And Coca-Cola / I'll come back to Ilse again, they had worldwide tour of Look Tappy a couple of years ago. Look was a biochemist, scientist out of Switzerland who was pretty well wrote The Metabolism of Fructose. He wrote it up in 2010. Now, Look Tappy was brought out to come out and say that fructose by itself is not the cause of all obesity on the planet. So, we've got Coca-Cola sponsoring someone to come out and say, yes, fructose is bad, but it's not the cause of everything. And this is health washing messages. And the term exercise is medicine is actually trademarked to the American College of Sports Medicine, but it was actually set up and funded by Coca-Cola. So again, we've got this, in Australia, we've got a thing called the Life Be In It program, which has been around for 41 years. And again, it's convincing us that if we're actually, overweight, fat, obese, it's actually because we're lazy. So the food industry, and particularly Coca-Cola, has very nicely convinced us, / brainwashed us as a society that we need to exercise more to get rid of our weight.
I mean, there's no denying exercise is good, but it's definitely not a good way to lose weight. And obviously nutrition is way more important. And this leads to the eat less, move more thing that's all tied into this, which is this thing that we've been taught for how many years that has done nothing for anyone. Everyone knows it's such a stupid idea because everyone understands that concept, but it doesn't help anyone do anything. And I've been trying to promote a term, eat densely, move intensely, which means eat nutrient-dense foods, right? Which is all these low-carb, high-fat type of foods just naturally are nutrient-dense. All the animal foods and, non-starchy vegetables and non-sugary fruits are very nutrient-dense. And move intensely. I mean, you don't need to do 3 hours of cardio to lose weight. You could do some pull-ups and push-ups and, some sprinting. And this intense exercise it has way more benefits and doesn't take a lot of time.
And that's what we are designed to do. If you go back to evolutionary concepts, which is, I quite like those. We are persistent hunters. We are able to hunt down our prey, but we didn't go running and jogging and leaping every single day in the gymnasium. We used to do that from time to time. I think the whole thing is fascinating as we go on. When you hear a term that doesn't fit within what I think is an evolutionary sort of concept or doesn't fit within the basic biochemistry of a cell, then start looking for the vested interest, and they keep popping up over and over and over.
Yeah, and eat less is such a stupid concept too. It just means be hungry. I don't get it. If you're eating nutrient-dense foods, if you're eating what we've always eaten throughout history, you'll be full. And maybe you will eat less calories because you're full. So I think you talk about driving behavior, right? To make these changes, you're talking about just driving this positive behavior and kind of just going against the modern norms of just, hey, it's easy to pull through McDonald's or pop in a microwave dinner. How do we do that?
Once you develop your own vested interest, and the greatest one I think is the health of yourself and the health of your family, you can start seeing those changes for your own. One of the things we've thought about the last few months is to maybe not fight the system as much head on. Mm-hmm. All I've done is gotten a fairly bruised head out of that over a period of time. But supporting those individuals that want to make change and supporting the concept of getting out to those people who want to make a change, because it's impossible to get the system to change because neither you nor I have multiple billions of dollars to fight the industry. But as individuals, you can make a choice as to what you want to do and what you want to eat, and in fact not eat, fast for the rest of the day. So individuals can make a choice about their health today, but if you're going to wait for bureaucracies to change, it's going to be a long, long time. We would like to see, as one of our aims in the next 12 to 18 months, is that the concepts of low-carb, healthy, fat living are deemed to be not dangerous, particularly in the management of diabetes, and to be considered as an option in the management of obesity, certainly before bariatric surgery, and to be seen for its health benefits. And now, if the public are taking that on, the media are sort of taking that on, you're starting to hear words like keto in the press now, and more celebrities are doing keto and feeling that benefit. So on one side, we've got this enormous food industry encouraging us to eat the Garden of Eden diet for the benefits of the planet, but it's actually just an ideological thing. And on the other side, we've actually got a grassroots-led revolution of people that are actually taking control of their own health. And so I think the best path at this point in time is to continue, keep calling out the bureaucracy, keep calling out the governments who are under the influence of the corporates, but most importantly, to keep supporting the individuals who actually want to make that change. And I do that with my patients on a day-to-day basis, and we utilise social media as much as we can. Podcasts like this, we've got some talks coming up, which we go directly to the public. And this is what, all of the people that I know in this space who are talking are all just trying to make a difference. Now, if we can do it one by one, if we can do it at a greater scale, all the best. If we, the rare moments that we get a chance to speak to bureaucracy, I know that we're up against lobbyists who are backed by the food industry with infinitely greater resources than what I have. So where do we go forward? One by one, I suppose, and keep leading by example. I look around, when you walk down the street, and you can tell people who are eating healthy versus those that are not. Walk around the supermarket and look in people's trolleys. Again, if you convince a few more people to change what's in their trolley, then you're changing the buying power, and that's really going to hurt the corporates more than anything.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I think I heard you talking about in a presentation or something about taking back control of your own life and how empowering it is, and that eating something sweet, eating like a candy bar in the moment is nothing compared to the long-term health you could have.
There's very little that, so many pressures are around you. You've got work pressures, you've got life pressures, health pressures, family pressures, and it's very hard to control all of those. What you can take back control of, as I said immediately, is what you eat. Most of us have got cars that we take down to the petrol station. I use this analogy, and in general, if you've got a petrol car, you put petrol in. If you've got a diesel, you put diesel in. You never put a little bit in moderation of the other one in the vehicle. You wouldn't do it to your car. So why on earth are we even considering doing it to our bodies? And the same thing with the implications for our health. We think, we'll just have a treat. Well, guess what? The term treat's actually been come to us, again, by the food industry. They're saying that if you miss out on sugar and cakes and everything, you're literally missing out. Whereas I actually look at it from the opposite, saying I've made a choice not to put diesel in my petrol car. Mm-hmm. And it's just changing that whole way of thinking. And as a result of that, I know that my car's going to run further and cleaner and easier, rather than chugging along with a whole lot of blue smoke coming out of the end of it.
And at the very least, even if you do decide to engage in these foods, you're at a social gathering, we used to do this once a week, right? When we were healthy, say in like the 40s or 50s, it was once a week you had a treat, or maybe you had one soda a week or one dessert a week. And I think just a major problem is for a lot of people, it's every day. Every meal almost has to be a treat.
Well, more than just every meal, it's actually the in-between meals now as well. And so the concept of snacking is actually a new one. And breakfast used to be breaking the fast if you used to go back. And having one solid meal a day was appropriate in the farming communities, going back a couple of centuries, not even a couple of centuries. So the whole thing of having, pre-breakfast, breakfast, morning tea, lunch, afternoon tea, dinner, supper, and then a snack before you go to bed is partly because we've been on a yo-yo, I think of carbohydrates and sugar. And that, just at a biochemical level, your insulin levels are going up and down, as is your blood glucose. And that makes you hungry. So if you've gone along and had a whole lot of sugar and carbs for dinner, there's no wonder that, 2 hours later, just before you go to bed, you're feeling as though you need to have some more chocolate or a lolly or something. Yeah. So the only time we're actually fasting now is actually between, going to sleep and breakfast.
Just in your bed. The only time people are fasting is when they're trapped in their room. Yeah. Well, this has been such an enlightening discussion. I hope a lot of people haven't heard this before. To me, I'm used to this information, but I hope people realize how this stuff is really happening. And this is not just some weird conspiracy theory. This really happens. We need to make these changes. And yeah, I think my last thought is people think it's natural to just wither away and get old and be in a nursing home. And that's not what our ancestors did. That's not what many people are doing who are changing the way they eat. You can live healthy and then die.
We're all going to die. There's no question about it. If you've got a choice of how you come into that home plate on baseball, you can either come in wheeled in your wheelchair with dribbling out of the side of your mouth and a catheter in, or you can come sliding into that home plate in a cloud of dust. And I've got every intention of doing the latter.
Yeah, as do I, and we're on a good track for that. So I hope everyone else gets on board with that and makes some decisions for their health. And you have a site called nofructose.com.
I've got to admit, I don't keep that as updated as I should because I've been caught up with everything else over time. The one which is probably more current is the one Belinda runs, and she's a wealth of information on all this, and certainly has some backup material, is isupportgary.com. And she's on Facebook as Belinda Fettke No Fructose after taking it over from me because of all the silencing. And we're both on Twitter, and you'll find us there. I'm Fructose No, and if you look up just Gary Fettke or Belinda Fettke, you'll find us without too much trouble. And look, I thank you, Brian, for all your work. I thank everyone out there who's actually supported myself and Tim Noakes in particular. Tim and I have become very good friends over a long period of time now, but we're just standing up for what's right. That's all we have done. And if we go back several years, which is when it all started for both Tim and myself, it just made sense. And most importantly, it was about doing the right thing by our community and our patients. Neither of us had any idea about what we were actually up against when we started making these statements about health, nutrition, inflammation, modern disease, when we did. But we couldn't have come through the other end of it, or out the other end of it, without everyone's support.
Yeah, everyone has been so great, and I so respect what you guys are doing and really look up to you too. And I think you guys are going to go down in history, right? Making a stand, and we'll look back at these stories and realize that that's when the change started occurring, when it got so bad that we were silencing our own doctors who were giving out very logical and sound medical advice and nutritional advice, and that we'll look back and think that it was insane.
I wonder about that. Belinda and I recently had a holiday for the first time. We were speaking in Europe at a low-carb meeting, and we were walking down the ancient roads of Rome, where people had been walking for 2,000 years, and you couldn't help but feel completely and utterly insignificant in the passage of time. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the important thing, is live life for yourself and your family at this point in time, and do what you think is right. It's not about recognition. It's just about doing what you think is right, because that's the best way to sleep at night, by knowing that you've done your best. And I know that sounds very holistic, but in fact that's the way Belinda and I live, and have tried to raise our family in the same process. So I'll probably leave you on that note, and we're just fairly humble old pair way down in the south of the planet, in a place called Tasmania. And as we've been talking this morning, I've actually got two kangaroos just have been sitting outside the study window.
It's great. They've been watching along.
Yeah, they're actually running fairly low carb themselves, okay?
Well, I mean, it's so amazing that you guys are a couple in the far reaches of the world, but are making a huge difference. And so I want to say thank you. And thanks for talking with me today.
Thanks for your time, Brian.
Can you believe it? The world is a crazy place. Let's support Dr. Gary and check out his websites and give him a shout out on social media. Also, please help us out with the Food Lies film by pre-ordering a copy and looking at the other perks like the Eat Meat shirt, the movie poster, and the Real Foods coin. Come say hi on social media where I post and comment daily. Search for Food Lies on any platform. And please leave a review of the podcast. I sent out a care package to listener Aaron from Ohio yesterday, who had the review of the week. I really appreciate these reviews, and they help give the podcast more visibility. Thanks again, and catch you next week.